So far where I live, it has been very dry. Overall, it has been a really dry autumn. We have had a few rains throughout October, but other than that, there has been no precipitation and it's been nothing but sun and wind. The grass is so brittle, the trees have lost their leaves as they go dormant, and the birds are beginning to go quiet as they prepare for winter. But instead of cold or any snow, as I film this right now, only a few weeks ago it was 80 degrees outside, and it's November. And I can't help but be disturbed by that, or at least unsettled. It felt more like early June than it does November, and there's no other way of saying that's simply not normal. It almost feels dystopian. It's not a movie, it's not a sci fi novel. This is real life, and climate change is happening right now. I noticed this even more when I was looking back at the historical weather data for my city that goes back 150 years ago or so. And yes, you have those few odd years where we didn't get our first snow until mid November, or overall the winter was quite dry. But on average, we usually get our first snow by mid October. That was to be expected for this region. And it's not until you look within the past 20 to 25 years, within this past generation, that you start to see that average waver and shift. You don't see as many first snows happening before mid October, and you start to see more years where we don't get our first snowfall until November, kind of like what we have going on this year. For me, it's just surreal when you put all of that into perspective, looking at the historical data and seeing how much has already changed within my generation. Just 5 years ago in 2020, my city broke an all time record for not having its first snowfall until December 10th, almost 2 months after the average first snowfall. That's simply unheard of for this region. I can't help but think about how much things have already changed, especially in comparison to previous generations. 30 to 40 years ago, when autumn was actually autumn and we should have had our first snow by now. But today, within my lifetime, during my youth and as a young adult, we are seeing 80-degree days in November. We are seeing snow that sometimes doesn't appear until mid December. We are seeing century old weather patterns change and shift before our very eyes. It's simply surreal. It feels dystopian. It reminds me of this phrase I read in the climate book by Greta Thunberg not too long ago, where it describes global warming as global weirding, a process that causes these weird, out of place, and extreme weather phenomena to happen again and again at increased intensity and frequency. Either that be 80-degree days in November, or flowers blooming when they should be going dormant, precipitation arriving 2 months late, or even birds migrating weeks in advance or not at all. It's these weird weather patterns that are becoming more and more unpredictable, ever changing and unstable, and in consequence, everything that depends on those weather patterns, like plants and animals, are becoming confused and thrown off by such erratic changes. It's global weirding, if you want to call it that. For it to be 80 degrees in November is simply abnormal and disorienting for this region I live in, especially for the various plants and animals of this environment that rely on the seasonal precipitation and cold weather during this time of year. For me, especially since I've grown up here my entire life, seeing the landscape from the hills, the mountains, the cottonwoods, the pines, the coyotes, and magpies, I can't help but feel a sort of sorrow and concern for all these beings that have persisted in this land for millennia. They aren't adapted for it to be 80 degrees when instead we should have had our first snow by now. These living organisms are evolved for and reliant on the cold, snowy months of winter. That snowpack, that moisture, is a vital influence within these ecosystems and environments. But because of how much we have altered this planet, especially within the past 50 years or so, that once predictable snowpack is changing and in some places disappearing altogether. What happens to these organisms in their corresponding ecosystems when it doesn't get as cold as it used to, or it doesn't snow as much as it should, or when the snow doesn't arrive at all? These species that have lived within this region for millennia are adapted for a climate that doesn't exist here anymore. And in some way, I can't help but think of these species as becoming homeless here. They are being forced to move elsewhere in order to survive. I think about all this and I can't help but feel a sense of sorrow. Seeing the landscape I've grown up in change before my very eyes, through the late blooming rabbit brush bushes, the bone dry hills, and the Canadian geese that have yet to arrive. How confusing it must be for these various organisms that are adapted for an environment, a climate that no longer exists as it used to. How these innocent organisms are at the forefront of a crisis that we humans created. They don't deserve to face such confusion, stress, and change, and yet their ecosystems, their homes, and sometimes even their lives are the things being lost and destroyed due to a rapidly changing climate. I can't help but feel deeply about all that. To think about these species, the lives other than our own. I think so many people tend to forget that climate change also impacts everything and everyone on this planet, not just us humans. Climate change has and will continue to affect all walks of life across the world. And not to make this video more bleak than it already is, but if we are not to get our stuff together as humanity, then things are only going to get more weird, unnatural, destructive, and grim. People, animals, plants, entire communities, ecosystems, and environments are going to continue to face the displacement, the destruction, and the loss of what a rapidly destabilizing world has to bring. We are here. This is where we stand as a world. And I think that is why I make this video today. Not only as a means of ranting my sorrow and concern and to get that off my mind, but to also simply sit here and acknowledge that it is 80 degrees in November. To remind myself and many others that seeing century-old weather patterns change within a single generation is far from normal. This is not normal. None of this is. And I believe we as a collective society need to realize that, even if it's uncomfortable and unsettling. We need to realize that climate change is here. It is not something that has yet to happen, but rather is something that is happening right now, within our everyday lives. We cannot continue to delay addressing climate change any longer. We cannot continue to perpetuate the very systems of exploitation, violence, ignorance, greed, and corruption that has led our planet here in the first place. We have to realize where we stand if we want to properly walk forward, if we are to prevent any further loss and destruction of innocent lives who stand at the forefront of our rapidly changing world. I simply do not know. It feels like a lot, but I can't help but notice all this and to think about it all, to feel such a deep sense of sorrow, concern, and worry for the various organisms that exist in the land around me, but also a concern for the life forms of all kinds all around the world that are going to continue to face the effects of climate change for the decades to come. I don't know, it's simply unsettling and sad, and maybe this video was a little bit hard to watch. However, that wasn't my intention for this video. I think in some way it's important to talk about things like this, to acknowledge that we are living in a time where 80-degree days are possible in November, to acknowledge that we are witnessing entire weather systems change and shift within our lifetimes, and to notice the changes that we are already seeing within the ecosystems and lands around us, to discuss how all of this makes us feel, and to acknowledge what we are witnessing alongside our sorrow as a means of better preparing and fighting for the decades that are to come. Anyways, I need to stop ranting, and I hope what I have said has made sense. Perhaps something I have said has resonated with someone out there, or someone feels similarly to how I do. Maybe I will look back on this video in the future as I truly wanted to capture my thoughts about this moment the best I could, but I think that is everything that I have to say for today. I look forward to seeing you all in another video soon. May you have a good rest of your day, and bye.